So I've already been seeing people who are commenting on Betaflight's Facebook page about mistakes that they're making as they are trying to put Betaflight 4.3 on their quad for the very first time. Number one, do not just copy and paste your CLI from your old Betaflight 4.2 quad and just think it's going to work fine. It is not. I'm sorry to tell you, that will not happen. It is so much better that you follow a true good setup guide correctly, and then you actually get in there and start either using the presets that are one of the new features of Betaflight 4.3, or you can follow along with this guide and actually learn how to tune your own drone specifically so you get the best performance you possibly can. So the whole purpose of this video is to help those of you who want to get into Betaflight 4.3, set it up correctly and not jack up your shit, and actually get in there and start tuning it to the performance level that it needs to be specifically for your drone. Presets are great, don't get me wrong, and I'm super happy that the Betaflight devs finally introduced it in Betaflight 4.3 for those of you who are totally satisfied with using presets. But from my personal experience, I can tell you that not every drone is the same. Not any preset is going to work on every drone perfectly. It's just facts. Always remember that the tuning process is essentially based on what you're feeling. Does it feel fun to fly? Does it feel locked to you? Is the feeling of the smoothness of the sticks where it wants to be for your particular use case? That's completely up to you. I can make all the recommendations in the world of what I think is good for a tune, and you can think that that's probably trash. And that's totally cool. It's a perspective thing. So ultimately, no matter what you end up doing, always do what feels right and stick with that and have fun flying. My process has essentially come from a lot of trial and error. I've used everything as far as fundamentals and ideals that I've learned from Chris Rosser, Mark Spatz, from Joshua Bardwell, and pretty much everybody under the sun who's had any sort of recommendation on the tuning process. I've also learned a lot from the PID Toolbox YouTube channel because that's one of the tools that I like to use when I do my tuning, and I'm going to incorporate all those things together and show you how I do my tuning process. Overall, I tend to use 2 packs at most when doing my tuning process, and because I've done it so much, I can get through it incredibly quickly, and I end up spending hardly any time doing my tuning process to be able to get a drone that flies really well. The whole idea of this is to show you what I do so that you guys can also be at that point where you can set up a drone, tune it really quick, and then get out there and start enjoying flying right away. Now that you've completely set up the quad and you know that it's at least going to get off the ground because you completed a successful test hover, the next thing to do is to go out and fly a pack and to get some good data for filters. What I recommend is you go outside and fly about maybe a half a pack and do at least 3 or 4 or 5 flips and rolls in all directions, forward, back, left, right, and also do a couple, at least 2 if not more, full throttle punch outs. So going from low throttle all the way up to max throttle, let it get some good hang time and come back down, and that's going to be able to give you some nice logs to be able to look at and see exactly where you're going to need to address any issues with filtering. Now that you've created a log, we're going to go ahead and reconnect our flight controller using the USB cable. Select connect, go to Blackbox tab, and activate mass storage device mode. This is going to open a folder that's going to have all your logs that you've created so far. You can just copy and paste them somewhere safe on your computer so you can review them later. Once you're done with that, go ahead and go down and safely remove hardware so that you can unplug your flight controller so it's no longer thinking it's a mass storage device. Replug the USB cable back in, connect, go back to your Blackbox tab and erase flash. You don't want to save a bunch of logs on your onboard flash. You don't have a lot of space, and once you've used it all, it doesn't keep recording. So you want to keep this clean as much as possible. While I'm erasing the flash, that's usually when I'm going and reviewing the log that I just saved and open it up in Blackbox Explorer. Just so you know, there is a new version of Blackbox Explorer that has come out with a new release of Betaflight 4.3, so make sure you update that as well. Very similar to when you downloaded the configurator, completely delete any previous versions you may have had of it, reinstall the new version, and it should be good to go. Once you open up Blackbox Explorer, what I'm going to recommend is to look at your filters. You're going to go to debug mode. If you have the workspace set up correctly, it's under the overview tab. And you should see many of these options down here on the right hand side. And I'm going to start with gyroscale roll. This is my roll axis graph. And as you can see, it is incredibly clean. Like I told you, this quad is insanely clean. Great quality quad. I highly recommend if you haven't had a quad that has really low resonance, you want to know what it feels like, check this quad out for sure. So there is one slight peak here at my 250 Hertz point this is what I was talking about as far as a dynamic notch filter to take care of handling this. I only really need one. There aren't any other real substantial peaks that I need to worry about. One notch filter, donezo. We'll look at pitch over here on the right hand side. We're going to click on the pitch option, and again, roughly in the same space, but it's still the only real thing that's showing up. We'll look at yaw, and yaw is pretty much non-existent. This should be true with a good quad. There shouldn't be a whole lot of noise on the yaw axis at all. I also like to go down here and look at my D-term roll and pitch. As you can see, the noise is really quite quiet on my D-term roll and as well as my pitch. Back here in the filter settings tab, as far as gyro RPM filter is concerned, I could probably get away with having just 2. I'm gonna go ahead and leave it the default of 3 because I tend to fly with really shitty props. And what that means is anytime I can be a little bit conservative and know that it's not gonna be too stressful on the flight controller, I'm gonna go ahead and get away with that. And in this particular case, I know that 3 RPM filters is perfectly fine. I only need 1 dynamic notch filter, and because of the fact that my peak was really nice and tight, my Q factor is gonna stay at 500. If you happen to have peaks that are a lot wider, then you might want to drop this value down a little bit. I wouldn't go much lower than like 200 at all. I would stick probably about 300. And what that's going to do is create a little bit bigger notch to handle that particular peak that's a little bit larger or wider. If you happen to have multiple peaks, as in one peak over here at 250 Hertz and one other peak down here closer to 400, and you're going to want to have another dynamic notch filter there to take care of both peaks at once. But in my particular case, I can get rid of just one, or get by with just 1 notch filter. D-term low pass filters. So if we go back to my D-term, I can see that my D-term low pass filter is right here at about 75 is where it begins. And it was actually on a downslope. So since I'm not having a whole lot of resonance or noise at that point, I can probably get away with bumping up my low pass cutoff minimum range up a little bit further and still not have any issues. In order to do that, all you gotta do is just bump the slider up a tad. You can see that value changing right here. It's currently at 75. It's a little bit grayed out, but it's still readable. I'm gonna bump this up to, we'll go about 90. Because again, I wasn't really seeing anything happening. This is at 100 is where it starts to kind of go up again. I could probably even get away with even further. It's telling me that my max motor noise at this point of the D term is around 137. I could probably bump it up even higher. But again, I like to be a little more conservative because I fly with really crappy props quite often. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it at a 1.2 setting. I leave my yaw low pass filter on all the time. I've heard from a number of people that it's really not a big deal as far as the flight controller being able to handle stuff. And in my personal testing with it either on or off, I didn't really notice much of any difference whatsoever in any sort of performance. So you might as well just leave it on. It'll take care of any additional noise that could possibly happen on the yaw. Click save. And we're done with filters. Again, you can generally stick with defaults for filtering with Betaflight 4.3 and be perfectly safe for the most part, and it won't severely impact your overall performance. If you don't have the right filtering, your quad will fly like ass and will also possibly take off as soon as you arm it. Dead serious. Since I already had the 1 log that I use for my filters, I'm going to use that as my first PID Toolbox log because I already turned off feed forward, my dynamic dampening's down, I already bumped up my 1.4. Let's just go ahead and take a look and see what it looks like in the PID Toolbox tool. Again, if you have any questions on how to get these programs on your computer, I have that video below that shows you how to download the programs and how to set them up so that you can follow along right with me. I'm going to go into the step response tool and make sure that I have that log selected and click run. So now that the log is loaded, as you can see, these are our PID traces that we've created with that very first filter tune. And based off that, we can see that our roll is actually pretty good. We have just a little bit of overshoot, and in most cases, people wouldn't even notice this whatsoever. It's very rare that you would even notice any sort of bounce back unless you were looking super closely in HD footage to even notice it. But what I would still recommend is, because we do have a little bit of that overshoot, we're going to want to increase our D gains to counter the high level of P gains that's pushing it past what's called the set point or the dashed line. The set point is essentially where you've told your sticks to go in that moment. So as I do a roll, I want my stick to go all the way to the left, push it to the left. This trace is telling me how accurately did my actual drone follow that stick movement. If we look down here at our pitch, there's a lot of overshoot. And this is actually very common for 5-inch freestyle drones that fly full-size GoPros. I'm willing to bet that the Betaflight devs, when they were creating the default PID values and the P to D ratios and all that stuff, they probably didn't do it with 5-inch drones with GoPros on. They probably did it with just the 5-inch drone by itself without using any sort of a full-size action camera, or even any action camera for that matter. And because of that, there wasn't this extreme amount of pitch overshoot that you see here that is quite common when you do have a full-size GoPro on. And this is why I say you need to tune with whatever you intend to fly with. I always fly with a GoPro, so I'm always going to tune with it. So naturally, I have a lot of pitch overshoot. There's a little bit too much weight on the pitch axis because of the weight of the GoPro, that when I'm telling it to stop rotating, it actually overshoots that too much. And that's why you're seeing the trace look like this. So taking that into account, we definitely need to increase our D gains, especially for pitch. So because I know I'm going to need a little bit of D for the roll, a lot of bit of D for the pitch, we're going to address that accordingly. Now I also know when I was flying, I wasn't hearing any crazy weird motor sounds, and I wasn't experiencing hot motors whatsoever, even though my filters are pretty low on the spectrum of a lot of filtering. Based on what I saw in PID Toolbox, I know that I'm going to need to increase my D gains to counter the overshoot that I was seeing on both roll and pitch. In order to do that, I want to attack both. I'm going to use the very top one. Dampening overall is going to handle both roll and pitch if I increase it by a little bit. I'm going to go by 1.1 right now for the increase to address both. Now, because my pitch was so much further of an overshoot, I'm going to need to specify that pitch dampening needs to be even higher. So I'm going to bump that one up to 1.2. And as you can see, my D values are actually starting to increase quite a bit. Since you bumped up your D gains, you need to start really paying attention to your motors and listen to them as you're flying after this change. What you're listening for is trilling or any kind of weird fluttering sound from the motors that isn't normal. If you do happen to hear that, immediately land and start bumping your D gains down again, and then slowly increase in even smaller increments than we did before you start getting to that point, back it down and you should be solid. Now, because I know from experience that my motors weren't anywhere near that level of either getting too hot or creating any crazy sounds or anything like that, I have some more wiggle room. And because I know that this is a good flight controller stack, I've used it in the past, I know that I can bump my overall master multiplier even more to see how it feels at that point. Now, this comes from experience with having had tuned in the past, and this is me sort of speeding up the process because I know I'm going to eventually get to this point. I'd rather just do it rather than sit here and waste time. But after these changes are made, I'm going to go ahead and click save. I'm going to go out and I'm going to be super careful when I arm up and when I very first go to take off. I'm immediately listening to any motor fluttering or hearing any weird sounds, and the second I come in to land, I'm going to feel the motors. If they're too hot, then obviously my values are too high. I'm going to bump them back down and kind of bump it up in much slower increments then. So with that, let's go ahead and disconnect, get back out there and fly another pack. So now that we've gone out and flown the rest of that first pack and we have a second log, we're going to go ahead and do the same method we did before to pull it off the drone. Go ahead and connect, go to Blackbox, activate match storage device, and pull that file off of the drone, put it in a folder where you can gain access to it easily later. Let's go ahead and open up PID Toolbox again. So now that we have our second log file open, we're actually taking a look and seeing that our pitch was affected by the increase in the D gains, which is good. We're on the right track. Now, it didn't seem to have too much of an effect on roll, and that's likely because the second time I went out there and was specifically tuning for PIDs now, I was doing way more harder full stick deflections with sudden stops. Knowing that I'm actually looking for my PID overshoots and stuff, I tend to fly a little bit harder with the rolls and the flips to make sure that I'm going to get the full overshoot that I'm really looking for. The first time when I was more focused on filters, I'm more worried about my throttle inputs and how much the throttle is affecting the filters and so on and so forth. Do yourself a favor and always try to do both whenever you're doing any sort of a tuning flight, even if it's just tuning filters, try to do full stick deflections, so on and so forth. That way you know that when you come in and look at your PIDs, they're going to be more of an accurate representation of any sort of overshoot you might be having. So now that I know that I'm getting really close to getting the correct P to D ratio that I want my drone in, I'm going to also start looking at iTerm in this very next pack. What that means is I'm going to do my normal flips and rolls that I would normally do to kind of just finish off the P to D ratio tuning, but I'm also going to do some full throttle punch outs and let off the throttle completely and just let my drone just sort of kind of sink and see where the nose of the drone's going. What I do to tune I-term is that I go full throttle, let off the throttle, and then just wait to see if I see any wobbles. If I see any sort of wobbles, that likely means that my I-term is a little bit too high. Now, what I want to see is I want to see myself go up in the air and see absolutely no wobbles whatsoever. I want it to be locked, nice and solid as I let off the throttle. And if that's the case, I can try to bump it up a little bit more, or I can ease it back if I'm seeing the wobbles. So when I go out and fly this pack, I'm going to look for that full throttle punch outs, let off the throttle and see if I notice any wobbles, or maybe I don't see any at all. I can try to bump it up a little bit and we can tune for I-term. So now that we've gone out and made that next log, let's go ahead and open it up in PID Toolbox. Select the file and open. I know based on that last flight that it is getting quite close to where I like the way that it feels. Now, always remember, yes, we're trying to measure these values and get the PID traces and all that stuff, stick response, blah, blah, blah. We're trying to do this stuff as technically as possible, but a lot of it is just based on feel. Does it feel good? Does it feel locked? That's what really matters. As a pilot, you're gonna feel, man, this feels really good. And if you get to that point, then just stop. You don't need to keep pushing and spending more time to try to squeeze a little bit out, because in reality, it's likely you could actually mess something up and it doesn't feel right anymore. So as soon as you get to that point that you think it feels perfect, just stop and go fly, enjoy yourself. All right, and open up this last log here. This is the next log that we just finished making, and as you can see, we're getting pretty close. We're not still quite there perfectly, but we're definitely getting a little bit closer. So based off what we're seeing here, we do still need a little bit more D gains, and this is something you're gonna find. You can actually get a little bit aggressive with D gains if you know what you're doing. If you go too far with D gains, you can create a situation where you're gonna take off and the drone's gonna go nuts. So do it within moderation, but as you become more experienced, you feel a little bit more comfortable with going a little bit further. I've been kind of conservative for the point of showing you guys what's happening, but normally I'd kind of go a little bit crazy with D and then go from there. But as you can see, we still need a little bit more D because we're actually still kind of getting a little bit of overshoot. Now, the feeling of the flight was great, so I know that I'm getting really close to how I'd like for it to feel, and that's really what matters. So based off of what I'm seeing here, I'm gonna go ahead and bump up both by 0.5. And to be completely honest with you, I think regardless of what I end up seeing in another log, I'm gonna be perfectly happy with that because I was at the point already where I liked the way that it was feeling. So we'll go ahead and save that. Now, I also, like I said prior, I went ahead and looked at my I-term. I noticed that when I went and did my full throttle punch out and I let off the throttle, I was noticing just a tad little bit of wobbling as it was coming down, which means my I-term's a little too high. This is something I've noticed is sort of typical in the 5-inch drones that I've flown. Most of the time, they actually do better with a little bit less than the default value of I-term. So I'm gonna go ahead and bump that down to 0.9 and see what I get in this next rest of this pack after I go out and fly. Because I'm really liking the way that the drone is flying already, I know that I'm already close to where I want to be because the feel of the flying was really good. What that means is, again, if you feel like it's solid, it's locked, then there's no real need to keep pushing it. If you want to get more, then by all means you can keep going with the master multiplier. Again, listen for trailing motors, feel for hot motors. Now, I tend to be a little bit conservative with my master multiplier than maybe some other people who are trying to squeeze out the real perfect tune, and the reason why is because I always fly with really shitty props. My props are always really bent or scuffed. Sometimes I just keep flying them even when like a little bit is broken off the tip, but that's just my personal preference. If you are the kind of person who likes to fly with super clean props all the time, then you could probably even squeeze a little bit more master multiplier out and still be within that safe range. No trilling, no hot motors. But if you're like me and you like to fly with crazy ass props, then I would suggest maybe being a little bit conservative with your master multiplier at times. Bump it up to the point where you start to hear the trailing and then bump it back down from that point to 0.1 below wherever that value was, and you should be pretty safe. And lastly, because I really like flying with feed forward, I'm gonna be straight up with you guys. I don't sit here and spend a lot of time tuning for feed forward anymore like I used to. I have been just sticking with the value of 1.2, and I'm allowing my master multiplier ratio with everything else to kind of take care of it from here. I could get into my stick response even more in depth by looking at Blackbox Explorer and actually looking at the stick traces and so on and so forth, but I don't really need to do that to get the feel that I know is gonna start to feel what I like. So based on that, 1.2 is a solid feed forward gain multiplier that I found for pretty much every drone that I own, and I just kind of stick with that. So now that we've made these final changes, we'll go ahead and save those and go out and fly into the pack and see how it feels. After flying the rest of that pack, again, this has only been 2 packs that I've used throughout this entire process, I'm feeling super confident with the way that the drone is feeling. It feels very locked, very precise, very smooth, and the prop wash handling is incredible. As soon as I give full throttle and drop off, then I don't see any weird bobbling or anything like that, so I know my eye term is solid, and the feed forward gains is feeling just where I like them. As soon as I give the stick input, it feels like it's responding immediately, and that's really what I care about. It's the feel that you're looking for. So now after all those settings that I've done and I've really locked in my P to D ratio, I've got my eye term where I want it, I've got my feed forward in there, I do sometimes go in there and bump up the master multiplier to the point where I start hearing the trilling and the fluttering of the motors, or I'm starting to feel them getting a lot hotter than they normally would. And what I do at that point is I would bump it back down 0.1 from where that started, and that's where most people are going to feel really comfortable. In my particular case, I was able to get my master multiplier up to 1.7 before I heard any sounds of trilling or fluttering in the motors. I would normally bump it back down to 1.6 in that case and be comfortable, but because I intend to fly this drone kind of like crazy and doing a lot of crashing, and rather than going and retrieving it, I'm going to fly it back in turtle mode and all that stuff like that. So I actually did go ahead and bump it back down to 1.5, which is where we had it earlier, and I feel a lot more comfortable leaving it at that point. I can't tell you guys how much I really appreciate all of your guys' support. It's the whole reason why I do these types of videos, because this is a huge labor of love for me. It's a lot of work to try to make one of these things for you guys, but ultimately I do it because I really do care and I really do appreciate you guys supporting my flying and so on and so forth. So with that said, if there's anything that you'd like to recommend or anything you'd like to see in the future, please drop it down in the comments below, and I'll definitely try to always address those things as quickly as possible. If you have any other additional questions about tuning or anything like that, feel free to always reach out to me on Instagram. I'm really quick about responding there, and I'll do my best to provide any additional support that I possibly can to help you guys get a really fun flying quad. So with that, hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your year. Take it easy and enjoy flying.